The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tanya Knight with Concerto Cloud Services. I want to welcome you to today's webcast, the 3 Ps of Workload Placement, Performance, Protection, and Price, where our partners at 451 Research and as well as our VP of Cloud, Greg Pierce, will be exploring the causes of repatriation and how you can maximize your use of cloud platforms. So with that, I'm going to do a little housekeeping before we get started. And one of the first things we're going to do is launch a poll. Oh, well, this may not be firing off correctly. Oh, here we go. You can let us know if you have ever considered pulling back a public cloud workload, and that will help our presenters understand where the audience is coming from today and maybe answer any additional questions. Okay, looks like everybody has had a moment to do that, so I'll share the results. Looks like there are a few of you that have considered pulling back a cloud workload. A few more of you are attending the session just to avoid that, and more are learning. So with that, I'm going to take us back to our slides. Obviously, there's a questions tab on the right hand of your screen. So if you do have questions for our presenters, we welcome those. That's one of the reasons we do webcast live, and we're happy to answer those. We do have some time saved at the end for Q&A as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Jean, and let her introduce herself and get us started in today's content.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Hi, my name is Jean Atelsic, and I work with 451 Research as an analyst on the Cloud Price Index and the Cloud Transformation Channel. I focus primarily on public cloud, but also have been looking a lot more at private cloud and in particular pay-per-use models for private clouds. Greg, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, sure. Greg Pierce, I'm with Concerto. With Tanya. I'm the Chief Cloud Officer over there and was one of the founders back in 2011, and Concerto is a born in the cloud company. Okay,
great. So this is the agenda, what we'll be looking at. As Tanya mentioned, this webinar grew out of research that 451 has done on repatriation of workloads from public clouds. In other words, we asked our enterprises in our survey panel, IT decision makers, whether they had taken data out of the public cloud and put it in back in the data center or into a private cloud. And the reasons behind that repatriation for those who did it are what we'll be discussing as the 3 Ps. So first we'll look at the repatriation and the reasons, then we'll talk about getting it right in terms of how to manage workload placement given the various cloud options out there. We'll look at some best practices and then have a Q&A. So first of all, why is repatriation happening? Well, first of all, here's an example of the volume that's happening. 451 Research has a panel of literally thousands of IT decision makers that we survey on a quarterly basis. And a couple of quarters ago, we asked the question about whether their organizations had moved any applications or data from the public cloud to the private cloud. In other words, had sort of retrieved them from the public cloud. And as you can see here, about 33% of the people we surveyed had made that change. that can be a very painful and expensive activity. And so we wanted to get a closer look at what was making them do this. And what we have here is of the 33% that did move workloads, these are the top 7 reasons. As you can see, performance and availability issues was the biggest driver. But what I've done is divided, these 7 reasons into the 3 Ps, and that's what we'll be looking at through the rest of the webinar. One thing that does not neatly fit in among the 3 Ps is the second reason we have here, that the on-premises cloud environments are improving. And what we're seeing there is that people who have access to public cloud are demanding the scalability and the pay-per-use features from their private clouds and from their system vendors. And the market is starting to respond to that and supply, those more flexible, more scalable resources in the data center. And so, along with connection to the public cloud for access to some of the more innovative capabilities of public cloud. And this is sort of an articulation of that in terms of the blue line here is showing that public cloud is on this trajectory. Its adoption is increasing as private clouds and on-premises infrastructure, goes out of maintenance and so on. But I think it's interesting to see that the orange and gray lines are really holding their own, and that is because, first of all, private cloud is getting very complex, and that's an opportunity for the hosted private cloud vendors to really take care of a lot of the nitty-gritty of the management. And then, again, as I mentioned, the on-premises private clouds are becoming much more competitive in terms of features and flexibility. So the first P, these are the factors that we consider to be performance factors among those top 7 reasons: performance and availability, latency issues. In other words, any delay in processing of instruction in a cloud environment, and then very well publicized cloud outages and downtime that might have occurred. So in terms of performance, it's really important to be careful about planning where workloads go, can and cannot be successful in the public cloud. So that requires looking at the applications that are being considered and determining whether they really can work in the public cloud. And there are lots of examples of ones that do a standalone, blog, for instance. There are scientific and, very bursty workloads tend to work better in the clouds. But here are some examples of ones that really don't work well in public cloud. A lot of enterprises rely on custom-built applications that have dependencies. Either they collect data from or output data to systems that are on site and that have been running on, on mainframes maybe for many years. And it's not a simple matter just to rip and replace that. And so it can make sense to leave those on site. Another example is workloads, and this might include databases that need quick access to data that is hosted on site. And CIOs, understandably, are reluctant to give up control of their data to the public cloud because there's uncertainty about, exactly where is it. If it's not on your own site, there's sort of a loss of control that, administrators have trouble doing. And this, becomes a matter of rules and regulations when you're dealing with data, for instance, healthcare data, financial data, that is subject to privacy or compliance regulations. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about under the second P, protection. So also in terms of planning, when migrating a workload from a on-site to a public cloud, it's very important to choose instance types and sizes that are suitable for those applications. It would be to actually replicate an on-premises environment in the public cloud would be prohibitively expensive. And people, when they talk about public cloud being cheaper, what they're referring to is that you only, rent the resources you need in terms of compute anyway. And so, it's very important to be careful in terms of how you're translating the applications from one environment to the other. Different types of virtual machines have different performance levels. In general, larger machines perform better. And of course, the larger machines cost more in the public cloud as well. But, better performance doesn't necessarily cost more if you're able to process a workload in less than half the time on a machine that costs twice as much while you're actually saving money if, you're able to turn that resource on and off. And then finally, containers. Containers are really a lightweight, portable alternative to the virtual machines that comprise most of cloud resources at this point. And rather than having to host the entire operating system the way a virtual machine does, containers just have the runtimes, and it makes them much more portable, and it makes them perform better. Now, as an example, a Windows, a medium Windows virtual machine has, maybe 9 to 12% of the capacity of that machine is used to initialize the operating system. And so with a container, you can get that capacity back. But one way to do that is by putting it on a bare metal, in other words, putting it on directly on hardware, as opposed to putting the container inside a virtual machine. There were a couple of interesting announcements at the AWS reInvent conference last week having to do with this. First of all, for the first time, AWS is offering it's previewing actually bare metal instances. And it also launched a service that allows users to use containers directly without having to manage VMs underlying them. So, clearly they're sort of adapting to this. And containers are considered sort of a modern application footprint to use in the cloud. Now, performance also requires monitoring. So once you've moved, it's not a matter of just letting an application run in the cloud. First of all, the cloud providers themselves are frequently adding new types of machines. Prices are changing, and new features are being introduced at a really sort of breathtaking pace. And some of those can have an influence on the performance and also the cost of running your infrastructure in a public cloud. One thing that has to be monitored is whether if you have a steady workload running in the cloud, sometimes providers will introduce new generations of that particular type of workload that offer better performance for the same or less cost. And you have to be aware of when that happens and take the trouble of migrating from the older generation to the newer generation virtual machines. Storage is an interesting question, and in fact, in public cloud, the object storage has seen the biggest price drop over the past year of all of the common public cloud services. And that is an opportunity for saving considerable amounts. So that's something, prices need to be kept track of. Latency is another issue. So in terms of improving responsiveness to instructions in the cloud, it can be managed. There are options besides so-called best effort internet, which is, the default type of connection. Direct connections are available from all of the hyperscalers. And what this does is it creates a dedicated private network for the workloads. And this includes guaranteed bandwidth, a speed limit, a latency limit, so and also privacy for the information. And these are direct connects are charged either by the month or per hour, but it does add cost. And then for companies that are actually distributing content, content delivery networks can work by putting data physically closer to the end customer so that it can be delivered faster as opposed to having to route from a central location all the way to widely distributed locations. And these are generally, all the hyperscalers have this also. There are also third parties. Akamai is probably the best known. Cloudflare is another. And these are generally charged on the basis of per gigabyte transferred. So again, it's possible to manage, but it does, it's an extra expense. In terms of the big public cloud outages, they generate a lot of excitement, sometimes inconvenience for, maybe for you or, a website that you want to access. But it's generally acknowledged that the big public cloud providers have a very good record in terms of uptime and availability and also security. So that is probably, reacting to headlines having to do with outages is probably not a good reason to completely abandon your public cloud deployments. So Greg, I understand you have some stories to relate having to do with optimizing performance in the cloud.
Yeah, I have a few of those, thanks. So let me start with one customer we had that had moved a fairly large workload to Microsoft Azure. And once they had deployed, there were a lot of issues related to performance, slowdowns, and to the point where the performance would even manifest itself almost as an outage because it was just so unworkable. And the mistake that was made there really was the provider that had worked with the organization on moving the workload had just forklifted it and never architected or re-engineered it for the cloud. So there were no settings that were changed. There was no right scaling of the different types of VMs and resources that would be required. So that's what we did. We made those changes that were required from a configuration perspective, what works better SQL Azure, what works better from an Azure perspective from a configuration standpoint. And then we also right-sized the various VMs that were involved in the specific environment, and it reached a not only acceptable but high performance level. And then the customer was very happy with it. So that was actually a scenario where they were thinking about pulling back on premise and decided that wasn't the way to go and that they would stay in public cloud, which is great. We have another example, which was a group that provides dealership solutions for car dealers. And that requires a certain amount of performance because it's a multi-tenant type scenario. It is over the wire, connecting to locations all over the place that may or may not have great bandwidth. And in this case, after analysis and determination of the best place to put it, it really did make sense to go to private cloud. And I don't think that's a great example of stuff that you move to public cloud that then you should move back to private cloud. It's an example of something that should have probably never gotten moved there in the first place, because it just had such resource intensiveness. It probably was never going to work until it was re-architected. The architecture was an older legacy type architecture that was in place.
Great. Okay, so moving on to protection. Of the survey that I referred to at the beginning, these are the two data points that I think belong in this. First of all, data sovereignty and regulation and compliance issues, and then fear of a security breach or an actual security breach, perhaps. So protecting data in public cloud is possible, but it's the public clouds do guarantee a certain level of service, but it does require a lot of work on the part of the customer. So customers are responsible for securing their applications and securing their data. If a security breach occurs, the public clouds will compensate you, if they, if there's been a violation of their service level agreement, but it may be, just pale in comparison to the actual lost revenue or, loss of face that happens when a website is down, when customers expect it to be up. Service level agreements, typically, the compensation may be 10 to 30% of the monthly bill, but it requires a great deal of engineering to make up your end of the bargain of that agreement. It maybe you have to have multiple availability zones may have to be down. Generally, it's the compensation is in credits, and it requires filing of lots of documentation on the part of the customer. So obviously, it's best if SLAs aren't violated, but when they are, it can be pretty tough to get compensation, and it might not be comparable to the loss. In terms of compliance and regulation, obviously we've seen an explosion of regulations, governments and organizations trying to keep up with advances in technology in terms of protecting people's data. And maintaining compliance with, certain regulations and having badges, in terms of PCI compliance for financial or HIPAA compliance for healthcare, it helps an organization retain access to big markets. And so it's very important to, have those in place. Again, this is a case where in terms of control and visibility of data, maybe not going into the public cloud is a better option in some cases. So that's the case. And then I think it's pretty, from what we hear, the biggest threat really to information security is people. And this includes not just scammers and hackers, but also human error and negligence. A couple of examples of that is there was a very well publicized AWS storage outage at the beginning of this year that was caused by just an individual doing maintenance at AWS, and it brought down, some huge number of websites. So, and then a case of negligence is the Equifax breach, which was caused by the failure of Equifax to patch to put a security patch into their infrastructure. And so that was just, not doing something that should have been done very quickly. Now, what we're seeing in the cloud is that automation and automated maintenance can help a lot in terms of ameliorating these threats. And that's one of the benefits of going to cloud. So the tools include identity and access management, which is, again, has to be configured and managed. Multi-factor authentication, so where you have to type a code to continue on a site, or, do a double check to confirm your identity, and key management. So these are available, but they have to be deployed wisely. And so, Greg, I'm going to ask you again if you have, I know you have some cases where you've done some engineering to help customers with security.
Yeah, I think that customers certainly need to understand before they make a move to cloud what exactly, first of all, just from a best practice, the security levels are that are required for them, and also what kind of compliance they are subject to. We had one customer that we helped out after they had moved over to cloud and quickly determined, and again, this is a recurring theme, that the forklift scenario, and figured out that they were outside of compliance pretty quickly. Fast forward about a month later, while they were still trying to work through that issue, and they were hit with ransomware. So, it was, anytime that sort of thing happens, it's very messy to clean up. We were able to get it cleaned up, able to finally get them to a point where they were stable again, and then get them to a point where they were compliant. But that was a long road with a lot of angst tied to it, and digital trauma, I guess would be a good way to put it. So the best way to avoid that is to make sure you plan ahead of time. Nobody had told them that the compliancy wouldn't follow. But there's different levels of sophistication within organizations, and if you're not 100% sure on the answers on security, then my advice would be certainly bring in an expert or retain a group that can help you get to that compliancy level. Another one that we saw was a group that deployed, and they determined that they were going to have to move off of public cloud in this case, because the compliancy that they were subject to requires exposure of what the underlying infrastructure is. And, there are compliancies that state that, and you're not going to be able to get that with public cloud. It also stipulated that customers should be able to do a data center tour, which is not always possible. And then finally, that anybody who touched the environment had to be a U.S. citizen. So these are the sort of things that come into play when you're looking at security and trying to determine the right path to the right compliance and security level for your organization tied to cloud.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I know that the public cloud providers are very secretive, understandably, about, their data centers are extremely secure to the point where, you're never going to be able to give a tour to anybody who needs to have compliance. So finally, the third P is price. Public cloud is, it's become so popular because it does save companies a lot of money in terms, compared to traditional IT. But once enterprises get there, as you've mentioned in your examples, Greg, There are cases where costs can get out of hand. And so this is causing a phenomenon that we've seen as part of the Cloud Price Index research, and actually this is our enterprise research, that cost is both a driver and an inhibitor for cloud. It's the top reason for going to the cloud, and it's the top reason for hesitating once you're in the cloud. I think what we're seeing here is different stages of adoption, and that, you know, the savings are an obvious driver at the beginning, but once workloads are in the cloud, the price has to be monitored very carefully, or it can get out of control. So, you know, this is just going into a little more detail about that. The initial benefits, it's indisputable. You are, you know, public cloud gives you a low risk, low cost, you know, in fact, low cost free. You know, all the hyperscalers offer a free tier to compute and storage and database and other resources. For startups and developers, this really is an obvious way to develop your IT estate. There are advanced tools on public cloud for building and managing applications, cloud native applications using containers and microservices. For a company that doesn't have a lot of cash, you know, having an OpEx model, so paying a monthly fee for your compute services versus making a big capital investment in equipment and software upfront is, you know, makes a lot of sense. And then, as I mentioned earlier, private clouds are also offering, you know, these features of public cloud that have been irresistible to a lot of not just companies, but individuals within companies who are actually going behind IT's back and using public cloud resources, are filtering back into the private cloud universe, and we're seeing a lot more flexibility there. Also, as the scale of public cloud increases, and also as competition increases, we've seen this especially in the United States, the cost of basic cloud services is coming down quite a bit. In the US, over the past year, virtual machine prices on average have fallen 8%. As I mentioned before, object storage is down 18%. Conversely, prices on, you know, some of the less common services, including database as a service and you know, some of the other sort of more exotic features that you'll find in the public clouds, those have held up a lot better. So they're not seeing the same price pressure as compute and storage. But as I mentioned, as deployments grow, cost also goes up, and it is really unrealistic to expect that moving to the public cloud, you will generate less data than you would in your own environment. There are so much experimentation and stuff to work with. There is access to machine learning tools which require a lot of data for training. Online data streams coming from all kinds of sources, you know, for ad tech and you know, websites, retail websites, transaction systems, and so on. Companies are learning how to use this data for competitive differentiation, and so they are capturing it, and creating those buckets of data is, you know, quite easy and initially quite inexpensive in the cloud, but uncreating them is another matter. The Hotel California problem, so you can check in anytime you want, but you can never leave. That's something that applies to storage in particular. You know, the advantage of public cloud for compute is that you can spin up compute instances when you need them and then shut them down. Whereas for storage, if you store data in the cloud, it has gravity and you are paying for it, whether you're accessing it or not. Now, there are different tiers of storage depending on how likely you are to access it. But what some companies are finding is that as their storage grows and grows, their storage bill also grows and grows in relation to their compute cost. And there was one very large company, large mobile company actually, that found that 90% of its bill was ultimately being devoted to storage because of all the data that it was collecting on its customers and locations and so on. Another case of having difficulty checking out is vendor lock-in. When you start using a feature that is unique to a certain cloud and you integrate that into your application, it's not an easy matter to actually pull that out again. And so, that's another case of where, it's easy to get kind of hooked in that regard. And then capacity planning, may seem old-fashioned. I mean, the impression is that, everything is, spins up and down instantly. But in fact, it requires some intervention. It requires setting some rules. There are the advantage of provisioning is that you get discounts if you make upfront commitment for resources that you're going to use. There are, auto scaling groups and so on that can accommodate more demand, but then you have to be careful that you're not opening the door for an attack where a company, where you're going to spin up more resources than you can afford. So, again, it takes a lot of planning and care. So in the public cloud, there are lots of tools for cost optimization. The first one, and the one that's been around the longest, is reserved instances. This means, making a baseline of compute capacity that you are going to pay for in advance, either in advance or on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. But it's a long-term commitment. And that comes in exchange for a lower price. All of the hyperscalers have this option. Some are more flexible than others. Google Cloud Platform allows you to sort of vary the compute and storage, the compute and memory dimensions. AWS, has some flexibility. The Microsoft reserved instances, which just launched in November, you can trade them in, if you want, you change your mind and you want different instances. Important thing to remember, though, is that you have to keep this at a minimum because once the, period that you've committed to has passed, the resources are gone. So if you haven't used them, that's just sunk cost that you're not going to recover. And just in terms of the cloud price index research that we do at 451, discounts on reserved instances have increased in all regions, and I think this is not just the hyperscalers, which obviously have a big impact on the average figure or the index figure, but also other companies, smaller providers, regional providers, local providers, they're following suit as well. Another example of a way to cost engineer workloads are spot instances. Now these are, similar to a spot market in the financial world. It's taking excess capacity and offering it at a really rock bottom price. The trade-off is that these instances can be interrupted, and sometimes without warning. But they can cost, considerably much less than on demand. So for a workload, a batch job or a low priority workload that can stand to be interrupted, that can offer a good deal. And also, all of the clouds that offer spot instances also offer tools for, managing the interruptions. So it's not as if they're just going to kick you off and, make you scramble automatically. They have tools for that. There are also third-party tools available for doing this automatically, and those include Spotinst and Compute.io, two examples of third-party spot management tools. So, Greg, do you have some examples of sort of price engineering work that you've done?
Yeah, there's a ton of work we've done in that space. I think one that really stands out to me and encapsulates just about everything you brought up was a software company we worked with where they were deploying a solution utilizing containers running on AWS, and had deployed, the first month they were in development, deployed, and it was $23,000 a month. Month two, they had a first customer come on, and it was a little early for them, but like anybody else, they want to get moving and get generating revenue and get the first customer going. So before you knew it, the price had gone up to $58,000 a month. Month three was $73,000 a month, and month four was over $100,000, and that's when they called us. And one of the first things that I'd say was an issue was, the developers who had developed the application also deployed it, which was a mistake. You really have to draw a line between dev and deploy, and there certainly should be a DevOps component in between to make sure those two groups talk to each other and connect. But it's a mistake to have groups that have not had experience in the past deploying, doing the deployment piece, as much as it would be a mistake to let the deployment infrastructure folks do the development. So they had already gone down the path once we started talking to them about to get a reserved instance, and they had gone ahead and done that, which is also a mistake. If you're in a scenario where you're overspending, the first thing you need to do is right-size your architecture, because once you buy the reserved instance, it's yours, for the amount of time that you've purchased it for. There's ways to turn it in on the exchange, there's an exchange store that AWS has, but it's fairly difficult to find the right match, and you're going to get a percentage of what you had initially spent. So we were able to figure out that there were zones that they had deployed in throughout the world that didn't even need to be up, that you could consolidate into more centralized zones. We're able to right size many of the different servers because they were over specified, and there were many of the servers that had been created during the process of go live that were still running that didn't need to be running anymore. And some of this sounds like rudimentary stuff, but it's things that we've seen over and over and over again. That's why I'm bringing these up. And by time they had gotten to a point of the re-architecture, tombstoning things that they didn't need to have running anymore, and then adding reserved instances, they resettled their spend in the $40,000 range, which was well within budget and where they were hoping that they would be. So again, I think that that's a good example. That the problem is that they had to pay several months of pain to get there. And once you've kind of created this this rabbit hole, you can't just climb out in a couple of days. You have to spend some time assessing and evaluating, which means that the clock is still spinning during that time. So the more planning you can do on the front end, the better.
Great. Okay. So just a few, takeaways, I hope, from the discussion that we've had. First of all, I think for all but the smallest organizations, there are advantages to using a hybrid cloud, some on-premises, some off-premises. Different clouds have different strengths. And so especially, you really have to take to look at it from the point of view of the workloads that you have,
and the requirements. And some, work fine in public and can save a lot of money, and some need to have single tenancy, so for dedicated instances or even on premises. Others, it makes sense to have full management if you really, if your company really wants to outsource their IT to another organization. So it's important to look at the characteristics of each workload and choose. For existing organizations, and a lot of companies are just beginning this transition, they've made investments in hardware and software that they can't just abandon. And so it's important to take an approach to adding IT resources that considers cloud for new workloads in particular, and also considers how to re-architect or refactor the workloads that are currently on premises so that they will work better in cloud, and whether that is going to be cost effective. And then finally, another data point from the Cloud Price Index is that if you take the cheapest service from a variety of clouds, and we survey, providers, we get data from providers that represent over 85% of the infrastructure as a service market, you can save up to 72% by picking, cherry picking different services from different clouds. So versus buying from a single provider. But there is, this is not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of management overhead. Supporting and paying multiple and monitoring multiple cloud deployments is no easy task. So it can be worthwhile for some organizations, but it's definitely not for the faint of heart. So, and that is that's it from my point of view.
Great. So let me give you just a little bit of a broad overview of Concerto. As I said earlier, we started up in 2011. You probably picked up from some of the examples that I gave that we do management of workloads in public cloud. We also have a virtual private cloud that we deploy customers on as well. We have a number of strategic partners we work with. We do public cloud deployments in both Amazon and Microsoft, and have just about every compliancy you could possibly think of. So without belaboring that too much, I'd like to get to any questions people have.
Sure. This is Tanya. I'll come back on and manage questions. And actually, if Gina, if you'll take us to the next slide, I'll give folks a moment to type their question, and I'll talk through some resources that we have for those that attended the webcast. So there is a questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen, and while you're formulating your questions, I'll cover a little bit of the resources that Concerto can offer you. We do have a cost comparison that can compare private, public, and what your options are out there. These are customized, for you and your situation. So it's a great value add offer, and I encourage you to take care of that. There are some sample cost comparisons out there on that link as well. We do have an offer for those running public cloud that may be dealing with those cost issues. And we have an offer that we can trim 20% off of your monthly invoice. The billing has to be over $1,500 a month, and you need to not be running reserved instances to qualify for that offer. But it's a great offer, and I'd encourage you to check that one out. And if you're not sure the path forward, we do offer cloud advisory services, and to help those that need to analyze a situation or a workload and those sorts of things. And so that team is detailed more on the link that you see at the bottom of your screen. So with that, let me go to some questions. One of the questions is, will the cost comparisons include the African markets? So we base our cost comparison on the Gartner price index data. And so I'm not sure that I know if that's in the African market or not, but it's the standard that we compare by just to keep it fair. Another question that came in is, and this is a great one for you, Greg, what do you suggest in respect to a security assessment? This person has a public cloud workload, they want to uncover the things that they might not be aware of. So where would you suggest someone starts in that situation?
Yeah, I think you'd want to start with somebody who can perform an analysis and do intrusion, run some incursion testing, determine where the flaws are. And look, when you go through this sort of process, you're not expecting them to come back with a kind of gold star that says everything is great. You're looking for the holes to plug. You should probably find 20 or 30 or 40 things that need to be rectified. That's always a great place to start. And, of course, that game changes a little bit if it happens that you have compliance that you're subject to.
Okay, I'm going to stick to the compliance category for just a minute. One of the other questions is, would I see a cost inflation to my public cloud if I need to layer in additional security or compliance standards?
So would you see a cost uptick? Is that the question?
Yes, correct.
Generally you would. There's different ways to do it. You can manage a environment on your own from a compliancy perspective and make sure that people are following the right processes and procedures, make sure that you have the right intrusion detection and so forth in place. But things that end up playing into compliancies oftentimes, like encryption, multi-factor authentication, those are the sort of things that generally end up costing more. Unfortunately, security costs more and has a performance hit, but it is a necessary evil to be certain.
Sure. So another question, if I have a new workload in a public cloud and I don't know yet that I'm going to see some cost issues, when would the signs start showing themselves? When would I start seeing those signs?
I think actually, Gene, if you want, you can jump in here. I'm answering all the questions, but I think that the way that you would see it is you'd immediately notice that the use case that you first created is out of whack. So you probably went in determining that you're going to have X number of servers running on a regular basis, and you would burst every now and again because you have an e-commerce platform and you get more traffic, or at the end of year because it's a accounting system, ERP system, you have more bandwidth, and all of a sudden it's pegged way more often than it should be, and you get a bill that is well outside of your budget. And remember, with AWS and with Azure, you don't have to wait till the end of the month to determine what your bill is. You can look at it at any given day and get a snapshot in time. So get that snapshot once you deploy, get it early. Look at what happened in the first 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, and that will give you a good indication of what your monthly bill is going to look like. The quicker you can get in front of any kind of cost issue, the better.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Greg, that all of the your public cloud provider should have tools for monitoring and budgeting and making alerts when you go over certain thresholds that you can set up. And also, Greg, another thing that you mentioned was tagging. That there are ways to tag workloads and describe them so that you know where overages are coming from.
Okay, great. And this is the last question I see in my queue. So this organization has some on-prem infrastructure that they've invested in, and they want to start moving toward the cloud. And what they're asking is, are there strategies to do that, to integrate? There is another question in the queue, so we'll answer this one first and then that one. But is there a strategy to still utilize the hardware and those investments while moving to the cloud and at what pace?
All right, Jean, your turn to go first.
Okay. I would say that there are lots of services and tools out there, and the whole, what we refer to as the hybrid cloud. So that's integrating exactly what you're describing, integrating public and private. All of the major system vendors and all of the major cloud providers are creating offers to try and attract people who do have on-premises infrastructure to get them onto their clouds. And so, it's a matter of the applications that you have, the vendors that you trust, and what, who their partners are in terms of, providing the cloud. And, that would be probably a good place to start is, any system integrators that you're working with, if you could, approach them. In other words, it's important to find a sort of a trusted partner to navigate your way to the cloud to, start migrating and switching workloads.
Yeah, well, and one thing that we've seen customers do, unfortunately, if you just bought equipment, say, 3 months ago, and a lot of that is going to be replaced with a cloud deployment, it's tough to walk away from that equipment. So we have seen many customers do a sell back type scenario where, there are hardware vendors that will buy equipment and then resell it on a market. Obviously you don't get the same return on it as you would new stuff, but it is an option to recoup some of your investment.
That's a great point. All right, I'll move us on to the next question, and I think the last question. This one reads, one way of managing cost is to straddle multiple providers with the added overhead, but how do you manage bringing those services into your private cloud?
So I'm not sure I'm understanding the question exactly. It's along the lines of straddling multiple public clouds. Is that kind of the question, Tanya?
I believe so. It says straddling multiple providers, and how do you manage bringing multiple providers into your private cloud?
Yeah. So in our case, we have a lot of the plumbing, if you will, of hybrid already established, and we've had it established for several years. So that allows us to leverage the best of AWS or the best of Azure tied into our private cloud without having to reinvent the wheel every single time, which is a benefit that we have where others may not have that because it's already pre-configured. And then we have expertise in all of the different underlying areas. So it really helps us to figure out not hey, what skill set do we have, and therefore let's deploy there. It's really what is the best solution here, and let's deploy and distribute in that manner.
Okay, great. An additional question just popped in. What is the turnaround if I need support? I'm assuming for Concerto specifically.
Yeah, and since we're fully managing, oftentimes the turnaround is done before you even know, because we're monitoring and remediating items before they come up. But the turnaround depends upon the severity of the issue. In other words, is it, somebody's color scheme needs to get changed, somebody one user can't work or the entire organization can't work. And, as a follow-up, we can give our mean time to resolution and SLA requirements if you want to right after the webinar.
Okay, great. If the person who asked that question, if you want specific follow-up, and let me know, you can do that through the chat or through the survey at the end. And so with that, we're at time, and I want to thank you all for your time. There is a survey that will pop up on your screen, and we would love feedback on how you liked the content and any additional needs that we can assist with. In addition, there are a couple of handouts. So if you'd like additional information on Concerto, there are a couple of pieces of material in your screen right now that you can download before you log out. And thank you, Jean. Thank you, Greg, both of you, for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.